Nerves are beginning to fray as a government shutdown creeps closer. On Thursday, Republican Senator Bob Corker took to the Senate floor and criticized his Republican colleagues, Senators Ted Cruz and Mike Lee, for grandstanding and delaying the votes necessary to avert a government shutdown.
I was just over at the House and talked to members of leadership there, and they would like to get the piece of legislation from the Senate over there as quickly as possible so they could respond. But it's my understanding, again, relative to this vote tonight, happening tomorrow instead, is that my two colleagues, who I respect, have sent out emails around the world and turned this into a show, possibly, and therefore they want people around the world to watch, maybe them and others on the Senate floor, and that is taking priority over getting legislation back to the House so they could take action before the country's government shuts down.
Ultimately, Senators Cruz and Lee lost this battle, and this afternoon the Senate passed its plan to keep the government funded, and unlike the House plan passed last week, it keeps Obamacare funded as well. So now it's up to House Republicans to make a choice, and they have until Monday night to make it. They can cave on Obamacare, accept the Senate spending bill, and keep the government open, although doing so would badly damage House Speaker John Boehner's credibility within his party, since he would be relying on mostly Democratic support, not Republican support, to pass the Senate's bill. Or House Republicans can tell the Senate, no, stand firm, and plunge the government into a shutdown. Unfortunately, given the time constraints and vote breakdowns, this is the most likely scenario. If you plan to visit a national park next week, it's probably best to reconsider those plans. But that's not all, because no matter what resolution there is to this government shutdown debate, there will be another huge political fight with enormous economic implications just a few weeks later. That's when the Treasury says it will no longer be able to pay all of its bills until the debt limit is raised. And here, too, Republicans in Congress want concessions to any increase. Concessions like a one-year delay to Obamacare, an automatic approval of the Keystone XL pipeline, and a rolling back of EPA regulations. Concessions that Democrats won't agree to and that President Obama said today won't happen. Meaning we could see a repeat of 2011's debt limit fight when the U.S. credit was downgraded and markets tumbled. Only this time, many economists fear it could be a lot worse. We already know that the government shutdown in 1995 and 1996 cost the government over $1 billion, and so too did the debt limit fight in 2011. Earlier, I spoke with Peter Schiff, the CEO and chief global strategist at Euro-Pacific Capital Incorporated, and I first asked him why deficit hawks are threatening such costly consequences in their efforts to reduce the deficit.
Well, remember, the real consequence, the real cost is raising the debt limit. Think of how many times we've raised the debt limit over the years, and think of all the additional debt that has been piled onto the U.S. economy that U.S. citizens are now responsible for repaying. So that's what I'm concerned about. It's the cost of the added debt. And I would much rather see a non-increase in the debt ceiling, even if it means, we have some temporary losses associated with some kind of partial semi-government shutdown. That kind of pain is much greater from the pain that we're all going to have to endure because we repeatedly raise the debt ceiling.
But it's estimated that just a 0.5% point increase in Treasury rates, which could stem from a default, would cost about $75 billion a year. That means higher borrowing costs for homeowners, car buyers, you name it. So I get that we need this sort of Chicago boys style shock treatment, but what do you say to the millions who could be put into financial ruin as a course because of this action?
Interest rates are going to go way up eventually anyway. In fact, the more debt we pile on now, the more we increase the debt ceiling today, the higher interest rates are going to go tomorrow. You have the president framing it for political reasons, but he says we need to raise the debt ceiling because America always pays its bills. No, we have to raise the debt ceiling because we never pay our bills. We can't afford to pay our bills, so instead we want to raise the debt ceiling so we can borrow more money instead of paying our bills. See, the threat is if we don't raise the debt ceiling, then the world will realize how broke we are, because if we can't borrow more money, then we have to default. But that day of reckoning is coming eventually anyway, and the longer we put it off, the worse it's going to be. So let's deal with it now.
Doesn't this also come down to austerity, though? I mean, the president, you want to reduce the debt. The president has, and since he took office here, has reduced the deficit faster than at any rate in 63 years. I mean, those are the facts. I mean, the deficit was 10.1% of GDP. When he came in, it's 2012, it's 7%. That's a 3.1% decline. It hasn't declined that fast in 63 years.
Yeah, if you want to spin it that way, you can make lemonade out of lemons. Yes, if a kid was getting Fs all the time on his report card and then he brought home a D and he could say, look, this is a huge improvement from where I was. Yes, the deficit is not as horrific as it used to be, but wait till you see how bad it's going to get in this next economic downturn. I think that the improvement in the deficit is related to the artificial recovery that's been generated by the QE. But eventually, we're going back to recession if the Fed ever begins to taper. But even if they don't, we're rolling over. And look, we just saw today the government having to bail out now $1.5 billion for the FHA for some of their mortgage losses. These are going to add up. And eventually, they're going to have to be bailing out not only the FHA, but Fannie and Freddie again. And as the economy turns south and as interest rates inevitably rise, the temporary improvement in the budget deficit is going to turn around, and we're going to be looking at annual budget deficits well north of $1 trillion. We could be looking at budget deficits on the order of $1.5 to $2 trillion a year.
Peter, you know markets pretty well. It's pretty well known that when there are market downturns, like there were in 2011 with the debt limit debate, and even in 2008, a massive market downturn, that there's an opportunity for investors to make a lot of money whenever that happens. You're a pretty savvy investor. Do you see any personal gain, or any of your other friends who see personal gain in letting the markets tumble as a result of a debt limit breakthrough here?
Well, they're not going to, unfortunately, they're going to raise the debt ceiling. They do it every time. This is all theater. This is political theater. The politicians want to get the American public to believe that the worst thing that can happen is that the government stop borrowing and stop spending. They're going to create a phony crisis, and then they're going to save us from it. The real crisis is the debt and the borrowing and the continuous raising of the debt ceiling. Why don't these politicians just put up a bill to eliminate the debt ceiling? What's the purpose of having a debt ceiling if we raise it every time we get to it? Because nobody wants to vote to eliminate the debt ceiling because they want to pretend that they care about the debt. But everybody wants to increase it because they don't want to cut any spending. But if you want to look at the markets, if the markets are selling off on the false crisis that we might not increase the debt ceiling, clearly there's opportunities because we know they're going to increase the debt ceiling. But ultimately, the biggest crisis it doesn't come because we fail to raise the debt ceiling, but because we do raise it and we repeatedly raise it, and that's why the country is broke.
I think that there actually is some talk about kind of getting rid of the debt limit. I mean, even if the president were to use the 14th Amendment solution, as Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi has suggested he should do, that would kind of by default get rid of the debt limit. But one last question here. About a month ago, a baby panda was born at the National Zoo. We're in these critical first 100 days of the panda's life. They don't even name the panda yet. A government shutdown will slash the zoo's operations, leaving only essential personnel behind, which could put the baby panda at risk. Peter Schiff, I ask you, have you no heart for the baby panda?
All I can tell you is if we don't raise the debt ceiling, it's not like the government doesn't have any money. They just have the money that they collect in taxes, which is still over $2 trillion a year. I'm sure somewhere out of that $2 trillion of revenue, they can find enough money to keep this little panda alive. What I'd like to see the government do is get rid of all the programs and the spending that are unnecessary and then deal with the entitlements. They can actually cut government spending. The government doesn't have to shut down. The cost of operating the government, including the zoo where that panda is tiny. It is a very small part of the budget. Most of what the government does, it takes money from some people and gives it to other people who didn't earn it and to whom it doesn't belong. So if they can't keep borrowing money, then the redistribution of wealth has to stop. And those parts of government can be wound down. but the essential government services that we all appreciate and that we all pay our taxes to get, they're not going to have to be interrupted. It's just the government that chooses to highlight the few things that government does that we want to try to protect all the things that government does that we don't want and that we don't need.
So it's all about prioritizing those payments for the baby panda, probably ahead of food stamps and stuff. Peter Schiff, CEO and Chief Global Strategist at Euro Pacific Capital Inc., thank you.